Hello, my good people. Now, you might be aware of, especially if you grew up in the 2000s, Shark Tale, the animated DreamWorks ocean-themed movie about a fish who's desperate for fame and respect, eventually takes credit of a shark's death, claiming he killed it, and becomes the city's hero. Meanwhile, a shark who's seen as a disappointment by his father befriends Oscar due to saving him earlier, and goes into hiding and faking his death. However, things start to take a bad turn as the shark Oscar killed is actually the son of the mob leader. There's more to this story, but this isn't a plot summary. Anyways, while the film isn't one of DreamWorks' best movies, I still personally enjoy it. Sure, I might have some nostalgia bias, but the humor is mostly funny. Some people think this scene is cringy, but I think these puns are kind of funny in a way. Heck, I thought of a few celebrity sea creature puns of my own. Leonardo DiCaprio, Natalie Portman, Amelia Shark. The world is pretty cool with how it mixes New York City with a coral reef. And it has some pretty good themes about the corruption of fame and greed and all that. I wouldn't put it on par with one of DreamWorks' best movies like Shrek or How to Train Your Dragon or all that, but I would put it above Boss Baby or the Trolls films. Anyways, the reason I bring up Shark Tale today is because after finding out about the original draft and getting some information about it, it did change the way I look at the film a bit, and also makes me question everything I thought I knew about it. Because let me say this, the original draft was darker and more cynical, and straight up had murder, and had pollution and mutation as a major theme. Wait, what? And it wasn't until more recently that we were able to find a deeper, no pun intended, look into what could have been. It's fascinating how different yet similar it is to the final product. Today we're looking at the original draft, Sharkslayer. That's right, the movie was originally called Sharkslayer, due to Oscar calling himself that after killing Frankie. Heck, they actually did keep that title for a while, long enough that some advertising and merchandise from before the movie's release was using this title. However, this was changed to Shark Tale, because they were afraid parents wouldn't take their kids to see a movie with Slayer in the title. But that's the least of this movie's changes. Trust me, let's take a look into it, shall we? It wasn't until this year, but we have found some of the earliest stuff in this film's production. And boy does it paint a different picture. While the story remains the same in many ways, there are some noteworthy differences. For starters, some minor things like the characters' names are different, such as Angie being originally called Bridget, for example, ironic considering who voices her. Sykes was originally called Polly, etc. Some story elements are slightly different, such as Sykes finding the anchor that hit Frankie, in which he finds out that Oscar lied, although in the final movie, Oscar just kinda tells them. Angie gets suspicious after going to investigate the staged fight and not finding a body. Well, in the final version, she already knew it was faked. And we would have had a scene in which Lola subduces Luca the octopus. Why she was doing this, I don't know. But based on a concept art I'll get to later, I think I have an idea. Speaking of which, she also would have been the girlfriend of Sykes, and then dumped him and gone after Oscar once he became famous. Also, she straight up gets eaten by Dawn in this version. Yeah, Dawn frickin' kills her. Unknown if this would have been on screen or not, but that's kinda dark. The pitch stops at Oscar running away from Dawn, so we don't know how this version ends, but I have two theories I'll get to. Speaking of which, let's take a look at the pitch document, shall we? It's kinda hard to read, but this is the original pitch document. Here it tells all the major plot points that happen from Act 1 up to Act 2, but as you can see, we don't know what happens in Act 3. And here it explains some of the original story elements, including stuff that didn't make it in, with the original characters' names and so forth. And over here is an early sketch, not concept art, keep in mind, there is a difference. Some of the early sketches show that instead of the city being built within the coral, it would have instead been a town built on the trash and junk people throw into the ocean. Heck, even the whale wash is labeled car wash, implying that it too was made out of stuff people threw away. Another thing that's interesting is that in the final movie, we don't know where exactly Shark Tale takes place. However, both the original pitch documents and the early sketches show that this was going to take place off the coast of Los Angeles. Which actually does make sense when you consider what type of movies Shark Tale took inspiration from, as well as the graffiti aesthetic the film goes for. On top of that, we have a few storyboards showing scenes that never got fully animated, one being an alternate intro which we see two humans sitting on a boat during nighttime, which is interesting since we never see humans in the actual movies. There's traces of humanity like the sunken ship and the anchor that hits Frankie, as well as the G-rated version of the drawing from Titanic, but we never see them in the flesh. Heck, there was another opening, which was presumably much more developed, which had Oscar being kicked out of his apartment by Mrs. Sanchez for being lazy and not paying rent, which is odd because she's a very minor character in the final film. There's more to that, but I'll get to that later, including another small story outline that's even more different. But I'll talk about that when I get to the darker tone the original script had. If you've seen the movie, you know the main location is the Reef, which is also meant to look like a city, more specifically New York City, with stores, roads, buildings, etc. We're to assume that the fish built the place, as the ads have punny names that fit the aquatic world, like Coral Cola for example, and Fish King, which doesn't really make sense. And the fact that everything seems to be scaled down to fit their size. And of course, the whale wash is designed to clean whales. However, in the pitch document, as already said, it would have been made out of the trash people throw into the ocean, and they kind of built their little town around it. Also, since the original pitch mentioned that it would have been in LA, it was kind of based on what LA is like in the real world. Even the place where all the famous rich fish would have hung out would have been the Viper Room, which is a real place. All this talk of littering and trash, as well as the smoke in the intro, of the storyboard I mean, leads me and a lot of other people to believe that in the early draft the fish were mutants. This actually makes sense due to how some fish in the movie look pretty close to their real-life counterparts. Then we have some fish that look oddly human with their faces, body shape, as well as their tail fins looking like legs, like Oscar himself for example. People say the character designs are creepy in the movie. Look, I can see that, but I don't think the character designs are that bad. Besides, it could have been worse. They could have looked like this. Ugh. Another part of me thinks this could have been a cool aesthetic, although one could argue it trivializes the littering issue in the real world. Anyways, a good amount of unused characters are as follows. An eel named Polly who would have been the one Oscar owed 5,000 clams to, and the 2 jellyfish would have been his henchmen instead of Sykes's. However, he was cut and that role was given to Sykes, likely to prevent overcomplicating things with multiple characters. Although eels do appear in this film, we don't know if any of these would have been Polly's old character model. Another is an orca whose role is actually unknown, but orcas do appear. And then there's this thing. Storyboards show at one point in the scene in which Oscar tells his lie over the shark's corpse, instead of Ernie and Bernie, the 2 jellyfish, being the ones that hear it, it's instead this guy, who takes a picture of him standing over Frankie's dead body, which he got the camera from a pile of garbage, hinting that this is the original litter version of the movie, especially due to how much bigger the camera is than him. But what is he supposed to be? It looks like he has a hairy head and 2 hooks for hands. I can't think of any sea animal that fits this description. Maybe he's a really overly mutated fish, but your guess is as good as mine. Overall, it seems like a lot of characters were unused or were rewritten just to be one character as opposed to like 5. The reason being most likely due to the fact that they didn't want to overcomplicate the plot. Although this was meant to be kind of a mafia parody film, and most mafia films have like multiple character stories going on at once. And let me just say, we're getting to the interesting stuff. Okay, now we discuss the element you're probably most interested in. The darker tone that Shark Tale, or I guess Sharkslayer in this case, originally had. While the final film did touch on some adult themes such as death in a family, corruption of fame, and fraud, I don't think you can really say it's a dark movie despite the whole mafia aspect. It was pretty humorous, and not in the dark way. The tone feels upbeat, and it's a colorful film. Yet again, there is this sushi shop. Yeah, think about it. That means there's a cannibalistic serial killer in the world of Shark Tale, and he opened his own restaurant and nobody cares enough to stop him. However, the original script, oh boy, let me tell you, this was really intended to be a mafia parody. The final film, while it does have some references to mafia films, only really plays up the mobster tropes as much as a family film can allow. There is a reference to the Untouchables during this scene with the sit-down. The movie is pretty tame for a film that took inspiration from The Godfather and Casino according to the pitch document. However, when you find out what the film was originally like, oh geez. Remember when I told you about those 2 humans in the intro? What were those 2 humans doing exactly on the boat? This is an official storyboard, and it clearly shows that the film originally began with two people disposing of a dead body by throwing it into the sea. And then the camera would have followed the corpse as it fell to the bottom of the ocean as the credits would have rolled. As somebody who grew up with Shark Tale as a young child, this is the most jarring shit I've seen in a long time. You might remember the character Luca. He's an octopus who was kind of a minor character. He was more comic relief on the shark side of the story. But not only did he play a bigger role in the original version, but remember how I told you Lola abducted him? Well, although Lola definitely isn't a saint in the final version, considering she's a gold digger who's only into Oscar because he's famous, she is a much nastier piece of work in this original draft, considering she kills Luca the octopus, then presents his severed head to Oscar to prove to him what a threat she is, as well as blackmailing him into staying in the relationship. This is real concept art, people, and considering it made it past the storyboard stage, they almost went through with this. Holy crap! Also, like I said earlier, Lola would have ended up getting eaten by Don, who's the leader of the sharks. But what's even more insane is that some of the early production notes state that there was a draft in which Oscar would have eventually struck a deal with the sharks, giving them more chances to hunt some fish in exchange of them keeping those he cares about alive. Also, while his girlfriend Lola is basically forcing him into the deal. This would have eventually led to Lenny becoming the true hero of the film, since Oscar would have eventually had a realization that he's no longer a hero, and has gone too far since he's kind of portrayed both sides. Damn! So to summarize, the film had the main character somehow be forced to side with the city's enemies, while being pressured by his girlfriend to keep it up, and eventually they would all start hunting him down as their main target, possibly going after those he cares about. Yeah, this is insane. It would have been a very different film had they gone through with it. Overall, this was going to be a legit animated gangster film that just happened to star fish, with the protagonist forced into doing horrible things and siding with murderers, realizing he's gone too far, and would have had a much higher kill count. The film does have its moments that reflect on this, like the already mentioned sit-down scene where Oscar, Lenny, and Sykes all meet up with Dawn, and we have the sharks being scared. And they do hold somebody hostage to get Oscar's attention, Angie, who's the nice girlfriend of the two. As for the concept art, while they seem to have dropped the whole pollution aspect early on, the darker storyline seems to have at least gotten some more consideration, considering we have artwork of Luca's death, as well as the sharks looking a little bit more menacing than their finished designs, and even the reef kinda looks like Gotham City except underwater in some of the concept art. I'm not gonna lie, finding out about all this not only weirds me out, knowing how a goofy movie from my childhood could have been a drastically darker and edgier film, but actually makes me wonder what could have been. Would it have been received better, worse, or the same? I mean, this version actually does feel like a Mafia parody, though it probably wouldn't have done as well since it would have gotten a higher age rating. Not to mention, a lot of parents would probably question the film's content. And if it was going to aim purely at adults, some might be turned off by the fact that it stars cartoon fish. But I am curious what it would have been like. Oh, and before I go, I did mention I have a theory on how the original draft ended. Well, here it is. In the video game tie-in, more specifically the PC version, instead of getting Lenny and his dad to reconnect, Oscar basically blackmails Don into letting his son take over the business. Well, I'm just theorizing here. This ending does feel a little bit more in tone with the original draft. Not to mention, video game tie-ins sometimes end up using unused ideas for the film. Heck, the console version of the game begins with Mrs. Sanchez kicking Oscar out of his apartment, the following level being trying to catch her stuff before it hits the ground, as well as a boss fight with a giant eel in the sunken ship, possibly being Polly? Keep in mind, we haven't found the full original script as I record this, but a lot of these production notes and pitch documents were only found recently, so it might be only a matter of time before the Sharkslayer script is found. So keep your eyes peeled, lost media hunters. Every film has changes throughout production. I don't think there's ever been a film that stayed 100% the same from beginning to end. But this one is interesting because it went from a Godfather/Goodfellas type film to a wacky slapstick comedy, while still keeping a good amount of the story elements. And that was my video. What did you think? Are you interested in more bizarre early drafts of movies? The movie Happy Feet is another one that started out as a much darker and weird film, including straight up science fiction elements. And unlike Shark Tale, the original script has been fully found. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, have a good one, and I'll see you guys next time.